You heard that? Recording in progress. Anything you say
Can and will be used.
can and actually will be held against you, no matter what. Even if you say nothing, it'll be implied that you're saying something, and we'll figure out what you're saying. Anyhow, Shalom Aleichem, everybody. It's the fourth and final lesson of this wonderful course called Outsmarting Antisemitism. And I hope that the first three lessons were meaningful and insightful, and we were able to all walk away with some idea about how to deal with anti-Semitism. So at the end of the lesson, we'll go through some of the points that we learned through the 4 weeks, the 4 lessons. But today we are going to embark on, in lesson number 4, we're going to embark on a very important, more practical idea on how to deal with anti-Semitism. But before we start that, I always like to share a joke about anti-Semitism. So there was once in a little town, a rural town, where there was an anti-Semitic mayor, and he wanted to solve his Jewish problem. You know, some mayors unfortunately have Jewish problems. Anyhow, so he prays that his favorite U.S. presidents will appear to him in his dream, and they will advise him on what to do with the Jewish people. So on the first night, he goes to sleep, and lo and behold, guess who comes to him, who appears to him in his dream? It's none other than the first president of the United States, President George Washington. And George Washington comes over to him and gives him the best advice that any person can give you. And that is, he says, never tell a lie. And that's all you need to do, and all your problems will be solved. So the guy says, false, that can't be. So he decides, you know what, he'll try it again the next night. So he goes to sleep the next night. And who appears to him the next night? Which president? FDR. FDR appears to him in his dream, and he tells him the only thing to fear is fear itself. So, and that will resolve all your problems. Again, he wakes up, he says, lies, impossible. That's not the way we're going to get rid of the Jewish people. Anyhow, he's very confident that by the third night, things are going to get better, and he's going to get proper advice from one of the presidents of the United States. As they say, the third time will be his charm. And indeed, his favorite president appears to him, and he sees his face very clearly, and guess who it is? It is Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln is there. And what does Abraham Lincoln say to him? He says, visit the theater. All right, I hope you got it. Gary, you could laugh.
Trying to figure it out.
Trying to figure it out still? You're a lawyer. All right, if you have to explain a joke, once you figure it out, you'll crack up. You might have a good chuckle in the middle of the lesson. That's the joke. All right. So today we're going to learn more of a practical idea about how to deal with anti-Semitism. As I've been saying in the last 4 lessons, and I repeated it in every single one of the lessons, because it's really important for us to know that the lesson is not titled Defeating Anti-Semitism, it's titled Outsmarting Antisemitism. And it's very poignant and very important for us to understand that we were not trying to, in any time during the 4 lessons, to encourage anybody to try to defeat anti-Semitism, because it's a moot point. It's not doable. I know it's, in a perfect world, that's the way it would be, but the perfect world will happen, of course, when Mashiach comes. So until that time, we're going to have to outsmart anti-Semitism. Now, when we talk about anti-Semites, there are all kinds. They come in all different shapes, and they have different motivations, different ideas, different lies, different things that make no sense, the illogical rationale, for their anti-Semitism, for their hate. They come in all different forms and all different shapes, which means that we have to deal with them on different levels and in different ways. We have to say different things to them. We have to make different kinds of presentations. However, throughout the history, what we do see is that Jewish people did deal with it, and sometimes they were successful, and in many cases they were not very successful in trying to deal with anti-Semitism. And obviously, anti-Semitism can be very harmful. At the worst case scenario, people get killed, murdered. On a better circumstance, they can negotiate some kind of diplomatic solution that's usually temporary. It never really was everlasting. But today we're going to focus really on people who might seem to be more reasonable. Before I get to the idea of more reasonable, we're going to talk more about people who are in a position of power. So who's in a position of power? People who are in commerce, people who are running big corporations, and the things that they do and say are impactful. They have meaning to what they do. People in the media, they get to talk to millions of people out there. They get to influence people who are in politics, politicians. Those are the people that we want to make an impact. But we are also going to try to gain some understanding on how to deal with people that we come across. So they can come across in our work, and that these people harbor some kind of a bias against Jewish people. There's some form of anti-Semitism. They're not Haman, they're not Hitler, they're not trying to kill you, but they don't understand who Jews are and what we do and why we do certain things and why we might behave differently. So there might be a tinge of anti-Semitism in them. So we can have impact on them. I don't know, we can meet strangers at parties, at different events. We can have neighbors, literal neighbors. We have to live for many, many years with them. And we have to try to have some kind of influence. And the worst thing is when we're running around screaming that everybody's an anti-Semite and we're the victims and they're all bad, and you're not helping anybody by doing that either. So we have to be smart. We have to figure out how we can outsmart anti-Semitism or anti-Semites and make a change for Jewish people so that we could live better lives. And if we live better lives, they will live better lives and the world becomes a much better place. Today, people who are anti-Semitic, they're not the Hitlers. So they come more from like a polite society. On the one hand, they befriend you, they sort of nice to you, kind to you, but they have certain positions, they have certain biases against the Jewish people or Israel. And that's what we're going to try to deal with today in our fourth lesson. So today we're going to discuss how we're going to deal with such kind of people, figures, and we're going to try to figure out how we can outsmart them. All right. Let's start off with an interesting story that I believe most of you should have remembered. Hi, Jackie. Good morning. You got the right place, wrong time, but the right place. So we're going to start off with an event that took place in the 1950s and the 1960s. And at that time, in the 1950s and 1960s, it wasn't like today. Weapons and arms for Israel procured their arms and their weapons from France, not from the United States. Today, most of the weapons and technology is shared between Israel and the United States. And America is the almost the sole provider, I believe so, for Israel's weapons and for the military, for the Israeli Defense Forces, for the military. But in the 1950s and the 1960s, it was France. At that time, Charles de Gaulle was the president of France. And right before the Six-Day War, in 1967, right before the Six-Day War, Israel ordered and paid for 50 Mirage fighter jets. That's quite a bit of jets at that time. Anyhow, right before the war, President Charles de Gaulle, and by the way, there's an airport named after him if you go to France or Paris, he placed an embargo against the sale of military equipment to all sides in the fighting. So he said, Israel, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Jordanians, everybody, nobody's getting any arms. Now, let me ask you guys a question. Who is going to be most hurt by this policy, by this embargo? Who's going to be hurt? I mean, it seems like it's a fair thing, right? We're treating everybody in a fair way, but we're not treating everybody in a fair way because the people, the country that's going to lose out the most is Israel. Why? Because the other countries had alliances. They were friendly with the Russians. So if France is not going to deliver weapons to them, they'll go to Russia. And Russia was all the more happy to provide weapons for to the enemies of Israel. Now, obviously, the French thought it would be good. By the way, I'm saying obviously not that they've said it, but it's logical. What you can take away from this is that the Jewish people are a small nation, small country. Didn't at that, and certainly in the 1950s and 1960s, didn't really have what to offer the world as we do today. And they figured that it would be better for Arab relations, for them to be closer and have good relationships with the Arab countries at the expense of Israel's security. So there is an element and a tinge of anti-Semitism within that frame. So we're not talking about a country, a president of France saying, well, we're going to gather all the Jews and lock them up in concentration camps and murder them. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about another kind of anti-Semitism where Israel is being harmed and the enemies are benefiting from that. But we're going to go fast forward to 1970. In 1970, there was a war between Israel and the Arabs. Of course, it was called the War of Attrition. This is before the Yom Kippur War. And at that time, Charles de Gaulle was no longer the president. At that time, the president of France was Georges Pompidou. So Georges Pompidou at that time, in 1970, he announced that France was, and by the way, the embargo still existed at that point. So Israel was getting no warplanes. They were not getting any weapons from France. And that was a big problem for France. At that point, they realized that they have to, they can't put all their eggs in one basket. So I guess they were making deals with the United States, but that's a whole separate conversation. But anyhow, President Pompidou, he decided in this embargo, okay, to sell Libya, who was at that time a sworn enemy of Israel, and I think it was Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi had just become the president. He created a coup and took over. He was a dictator for many years, and we all know what his fate was a few years ago. But anyhow, they are sworn enemies of Israel, and he sells them, at least the news reports, 50 fighter jets. But actually, it was actually 150, but 50 is enough. Let me ask you guys a question. Libya at that time in 1970 did not have any capabilities of waging war against Israel. They wouldn't even know what to do with these fighter jets. They didn't have the training. There's nothing they can do with it. So it was sort of like a wink-wink situation where Libya would take these fighter jets, and what would they do with them? They would share them with the enemies of Israel, Egypt, Syria, Jordan. Those guys had trained pilots, and that's where those planes would be used. And ultimately, that's exactly what happened. So Georges Pompidou, who is the president of France, is behaving now. He's taking an action that is harming Israel in a very, very direct way. He is selling arms to the enemies of Israel, and it's going to affect Israel in a terrible way. You can imagine, and I guess some of you might remember this. I don't remember this. I was a little young at that time. But the Jewish communities in the United States and all over the world, throughout the entire world, were very, very upset at what was at this policy that Pompidou was enacted. Let me just quickly read text number 1. This is what Henry Kissinger writes, page 116. Here it goes. After much hesitation, French officials acknowledged tonight that about 50 Mirage jet fighters planes would be sold to Libya. The confirmation of the sale was expected to provoke sharp protests from Israel. The Israelis suspect that the planes will sooner or later find their way to the fighting front. The French Defense Ministry reaffirmed the French embargo policy of selling no arms to the countries directly in conflict with Israel. So they were arguing, well, Libya is not in direct conflict with Israel. They're not going to use those fighter jets to harm Israel. But what we all know is, obviously, it's going to be given over to the Egyptians. The United Arab Republic, which is Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and said that they were convinced that Libya sought to supply her own forces. Israeli fears of the Libyan Mirage is based on a conviction shared by some French experts that the Libyan Air Force, in its present state, could not absorb such members of a highly advanced plane. The fear is compounded by the aggressive stance taken toward Israel by the new revolutionary military regime, which has been in power in Libya since early September. The plane was sold to Libya, is believed to be the Mirage 3, the same type as the 50 built for Israel, but placed under embargo in 1967. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling the fact that they have been denied about the same number of planes now made available to a hostile Arab country. So this act of selling planes, these 50 Mirage planes, by the way, that's what was reported. From what I understand, it was actually 150 planes. That's a lot, heck of a lot of planes that Libya would not know what to do with. Totally an act of anti-Semitism, because it was going to harm the Jewish people and the land of Eretz Israel. So let's go back in time in 1970, and we're all wearing our long hair. We're a bunch of hippies, and we're a bunch of Jews, but we support Israel, and we support the security of the land of Israel. So what were Jewish people supposed to do in terms of fighting back in regards to this policy from President George Pompidou? What would you guys say? What were we supposed to do?
Give money.
To who?
That's what happened in my town. They had big meeting in the temple and everybody gave money.
Oh, very good. So Harvey says, let's give money to Israel. I didn't think to France.
No.
So we should support Israel, add more money. And that's a beautiful thing. That's absolutely. What else can we do? What other things can we do? All right, so we are going to learn. Actually, what happened at that time was there were major protests in the United States, and of course in Israel, but mostly in the United States, and they pushed back against President Pompidou, and guess what? He was not a happy camper. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Anyhow, he was not a happy camper at that time. They insulted him, they shamed his wife. It was in the days when Jewish people had that kind of a power. Today, it's a little different. But at that time, and by the way, which is in its own right anti-Semitism, we're going to get to talk about all of those things. We're going to get back to this story towards the end of the lesson. But so in order to get to that, to address this story, we have to really now use the lenses of the Torah, because that's what we do in the JLI classes. We're not here to pontificate, secular ideas. We're here to sell ideas that are sourced in our own Torah, in Jewish life. That's what we do. So we're going to have to look in the Torah to find some kind of precedence how Jewish people dealt with anti-Semitism. So does anybody know any good story in the Torah where you can look back and say, that's a story that that might be the prototype of how Jewish people should behave or should react when there's anti-Semitism in their lifetime. So the story of Purim, which we've been using, and we're going to end off with, but I want to go back to the 5 books of Moses, and I want to see where in those books of the Moses, and I'll give you an example. We could use the first book of the Torah, the book of Genesis, Bereshit. I'll make it even easier for you. We read it in the parsha last week. Harvey, you were in shul last week. What did we learn about the story of Jacob? Exactly. Jacob.
Esau was coming and how he had it.
Exactly. We spoke. You got it. With all those hints. Even then, he's such a smart guy. So the story is Jacob. Jacob had a twin brother. So you imagine they're the same age. They grew up together. They had the same circumstances, same mother, same father. They were twins. And Yaakov, we know the Torah calls him Ish Tam Yoshev Ahalim, which means that he was a wholesome person, sat in the tent. So what does it mean he sat in the tent? He wasn't gambling in the tent. He was studying. He was a scholar. He was devoted to the worship and the service of God, helping people, doing good stuff. He was behaving like his father Yitzchak, behaving like his grandfather Abraham. Esav, on the other hand, what was he known for? What was he big at? What was his forte? He was a hunter. All right, he was a gambler. He was a murderer. He was not a very good guy. He basically put expediency and pleasure before everything else. He didn't really have much meaning and much, not much deeper depth in his life. Anyhow, we all know the story, because I don't want to go through the whole story because we don't want to use up all our time for that. But what is important for us to remember is that Yitzchak, their father, called the evil son, the bad son, Esav, and he says to him, Esav, I have a blessing that I'd like to give you. And I got only one of those blessings, and it's a materialistic blessing, meaning that you and your descendants will always flourish in a material way. If you prepare a meal for me, when you come back, you will get that meal. Now, guess who found out about that? Rivka. That's their mother. But Rivka was never really a big fan of her son Esav. She was a huge fan of her son Yaakov, and she tells Yaakov, I want you to go and I want you to take that blessing. I'm not going to get into the discussion if it was the right thing, it was the wrong thing. We all know it's the right thing, but that's a whole separate discussion. The point is that Yaakov did receive the bracha. Once Jacob receives the bracha, can Esav get that same bracha? No more. It's no longer available. You get to use it one time and one time only. So Esav comes home and he says to his dad, Dad, here's your meal that I prepared for you, and now I'm ready to receive the bracha. And his dad is shocked. It says that hell broke loose. And Yitzchak was kind of shocked and surprised. But Esav became really, really upset and really mad. And what did he vow at that moment? That he was going to take revenge from his brother Yaakov. He was going to kill his brother Yaakov. So what does Yaakov have to do? Run, flee. And Yaakov runs to Uncle Laban. That's Rivka's brother. And I'm sorry, that's Rivka's. That's Rivka's brother. He runs to his uncle, and he ultimately marries Leah, and then he marries Rachel, and then he marries the concubines, and they end up with 13 children. After 20 years, what does Jacob decide to do? Enough is enough. Living with Uncle Laban, is living in horror. It's a terrible place to live. He's not an honest man. He is not a good example for his kids and for the whole family. So Yaakov starts marching and traveling towards the land of Israel. On his way, he got intelligence that who was coming towards him? His brother Esav. And not only was Esav coming, he was coming with 400 men, which means they were soldiers, they were mercenaries. And what do you think, when a guy is showing up with his 400 soldiers, they're not coming to have lunch. They're coming to wage war. So Yaakov knew that he had a problem on his hands. His security now has been minimized, is almost diminished. He's got a real problem. He has to save his family. That is the first recording of a Jewish person who has to now fend for themselves when it comes to hatred of another one of his people. So Yaakov is now faced with Esav's anti-Semitism, and Yaakov decides that he has to prepare himself. So what does the Torah tell us? That he prepared himself in 3 manners, in 3 ways. Let's read the 3 manners that he prepared himself in. Text number 2, page 119. This is from the Midrash. Jacob prepared himself for a three-pronged response: a prayer, a gift, and an armed struggle. Well, a prayer you can always use. There's no atheist in a foxhole. So prayer was very appropriate. That was a good thing. But then he starts preparing these gifts. And then, of course, he prepares for the armed struggle. But let's focus a moment for the idea of gifts, because prayer is understandable. War is also understandable. But what does Yaakov want mostly? What does he want? He wants to bring security to himself and his entire family. He does not want to see warfare between himself and his brother Esav, especially his brother Esav is coming with trained soldiers, and they have good weapons, and they have mirages and tanks and all those things. And Yaakov almost didn't stand a chance to win the war against his brother. So he's focused on this idea of gifts. It was a diplomatic solution that he was going to create. What is these gifts? By the way, if you think about the gifts that he lavished his brother with, the calculation could be over 500 gifts. But he didn't bring all 500 gifts at once. You ever, like a Hanukkah? Hanukkah, we give gifts. We as Jewish people, we're smart people. We don't have one day. We have 8 days. And every night you give one gift. The first night, it's a smaller gift. The next night, a little bigger. And maybe the third night, actually by me, I increase it every night. I give out money to my children. First night, I give out $1. Second night, I give $2. The third night, $3. So on and so forth. And by the time you get to the 8th night, it is $8. So they make quite a bit of money, the kids. And inflation, oh boy, maybe $1 has to become $2. Who knows? But let's not get into that point right now. But the bottom line is that he was giving his brother incrementally these gifts. So what he's really doing, he's trying to get his brother to sort of melt. His heart should melt. His neshama should become a little bit more warm towards him. And guess what? All these many gifts that Yaakov gave to his brother, what did it do? It appeased his brother. It made his brother have more compassion and more love to his brother. And at the end of the day, by giving by giving these gifts, what happened? What was the end result? There was no war at the end. And what does the Torah say? What did they do when they met each other? When Jacob and Esav met each other, what did they do? They embraced. They hugged each other and they kissed each other. Vayishakeyu, that's what the Torah says. Vayichabkeyu, vayishakeyu. They embraced and they kissed each other. It's a very powerful thing. Just want to say something very important. That Yaakov, he's sort of setting the trend or the possibility of negotiating with an anti-Semite. So this would be the prototype. This would be the example for the rest of history for the Jewish people till our very own time. It's important to remember that Jacob was not acting out of weakness. He was not acting as a timid and fearful Jew. That's not what he was doing. He was a proud Jew. He was not going to compromise in his Judaism. What he was doing was he was believing in the idea, which we spoke about in the beginning of the course. And that is that every blessing that we have in our lives is from God. They are our miracles. These miracles are discreet. These miracles are concealed. One cannot see it. And we have to create the vessel. That means we have to do something physical to allow God to do his magic, for God to allow God to create that miracle. So by giving the gifts, what did Yaakov do? Yaakov allowed Hashem to create a miracle where Esav was not going to fire upon the Jewish people at that time. So, by the way, the Jewish people, the population was, a family of 13 kids with 4 wives, but they also, he had grandchildren at that point, but you have to remember he had servants and he had people, following people who believed in, converting at that time, whatever conversion meant at that time, and they became Jews. So there are a bunch of Jews. So he's not only bringing security for his family, but to a bunch of other people. So he's the leader. He's got to bring that responsibility, but he does not come as a weak Jew. He comes as a very powerful Jew with a lot of strength. And he says, I only bow down to God. I only am fearful of Hashem. So yes, he does things to appease his brother. He gives him those gifts, but that is a mechanism to create the miracle from God. But here's the interesting point, that when Yaakov was trying to create a diplomatic solution so that nobody gets hurt, right? Was he trying to transform his brother Esav from being a hater to a complete lover of Jewish people and maybe make him a Jew? Was he trying to do that? What do you guys think?
No.
Not at all. He was not. He knew that was sort of off the table. Sometimes you have to know your priorities. You have to know the reality on the ground. You have to understand what is happening on the ground. And Yaakov certainly understood that transformation of his brother is not on the table. That's not what's negotiable here. What's negotiable here is giving him gifts and sort of melting his heart so that they can become friends. And how do I know this? So this week, if you were listening while we were reading the Torah, and when we got to the verse, Vayishakehu, we saw that, it's in the Torah, in the actual, parchment, because in the parchment, there are no symbols. There's no commas, there's no periods. And all of a sudden you see on top of the word Vayishakehu, did you see that? Yeah, there's 5 dots. So people ask the question, what's with the 5 dots? And especially when you're reading the Torah, even when I read it every year, I know about it, but here goes the 5 dots. And it's like kind of different. I don't believe anywhere else in the Torah it has 5 dots. Okay. He's correcting the rabbi over here. Could be. I think you're correct. But anyhow, but what is the meaning of the 5 dots? It's trying to tell us something. It's like right in your face, 5 dots on top of a word. It doesn't have, if it happens, it's 2 times. So what is the meaning of that? What is the reason for that? Well, I'm proud of you that you pay attention to the classes. Okay, that's a good thing, by the way. Somebody's paying attention at least there. And I don't mind if I put people to sleep in a class. You guys know all that my mitzvah is to cure insomnia. So if anybody falls asleep and they've never slept before, so I got a mitzvah either way. If you learn something, I got a mitzvah. If you fall asleep, I got a mitzvah. All right, enough of that. But the bottom line is that the 5 dots represents that Esav did not embrace Yaakov wholeheartedly. It was maybe for that moment that he had love and he experienced that love, but trust me, before that and after that, that love dissipated or was not even there. Let's read what
so the Torah is basically making commentary on
comment exactly, which is very well. The rabbis are saying that that's what it is, and we have to believe that is a piece of information that might come all the way back from the times of Moses. But yes, the Torah. There's a few times, there's 4 or 5 times with big letters, small letters, trying to create commentary, sort of hints that you should learn something big is going on. So they throw 5 dots. But here's what the Torah says. Esav ran towards Jacob and embraced him. He fell on Jacob's neck and kissed him, and they wept. Let's read text number 4. Here it goes. The Torah features dots over the words, and he kissed him. And this is because Esav did not kiss Jacob wholeheartedly. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, it is an established fact. By the way, in Hebrew, he says it's a halacha. Halacha means it's a rule, it's a law. So it's established. That means a law is non-negotiable in Judaism. And maybe in America we can amend laws, we can change laws, eradicate laws, delete them, cancel them. But in Torah you can't cancel a law. Anyhow, what is the established fact? That Esav hates Jacob. Nevertheless, his compassion was moved at that time, and he kissed him wholeheartedly. Who said this last point? The first point is made by some chachamim, some wise men, the scholars of those times. But the second point, where he says that it is an established fact, it's the law, which means it's not negotiable, it's not transformational, it's not changeable, that Esav always hates it. It was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And in a few minutes, we're going to learn about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, how he sees the Romans, by the way, because he lives in the 2nd century. So he saw the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and he sees what the Romans have done. And he himself was a victim of the Romans. The Romans were after him, after his head, and they already convicted him, and they were going to kill him. And he hid for 12 years, 13 years, with his son, until finally it was safe for him to leave. So this is a man who hated the Romans, but we're going to get to that in a few minutes. So the Torah is really suggesting to us that we don't need to transform an anti-Semite. We can somehow influence them to change their position. Jacob did a great job trying to convince. He was successful in his convincing his brother to change his plan from coming with 400 men and eradicating and creating a genocide. And here he created a sense of, not a sense, he created security and stability, and the Jewish people were able to go into the land, and he was very successful of that. So this is the story that really helps us to understand the importance of creating a diplomatic solution. And this becomes our precedence. This becomes the prototype of how a Jew should take steps towards creating security for the Jewish people. Because if you think you're going to go out there and you're going to get your guns and you're going to get your protests and you're going to do your shaming and all of that, not necessarily is that going to help the cause. In fact, in some cases, you can actually exacerbate it and make it actually worse. And we're going to get to that a little later on. But let me talk about this great rabbi whose name was Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai lived during the times of the Romans, and Nachmanides talks about what Rabbi Yanai would do when he would meet up with the Romans. He'd always have to go to Rome and discuss with the Roman officials, maybe with the emperor, and talk to them about bringing some kind of diplomatic solutions. They were making awful decrees against Jews all the time. Anti-Semitism was rampant. Hate was rampant against the Jews. Rabbi Yanai had to be in constant contact with the great leaders of the Romans. So Rabbi Yanai would go, but before he went in to meet the Romans, he recited passages from the Torah. Guess which passages he recite before he went in? Let's read it on text number 5, page 121. The Medrash relates that when Rabbi Yanai would set out for a meeting with the Roman government, he would first read the passage in the Torah regarding Jacob and Esau. The sages had a tradition that this passage was a guide for our exile. Therefore, when Rabbi Yanai would visit the rulers of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage to follow the advice of the wise Jacob. It is indeed appropriate for all generations to study his approach and to adopt it in actual practice. Clearly, the story of Jacob taught Jewish people throughout history how to behave when we had to deal in a diplomatic way with anti-Semitism. If you look at the Rashbi, that's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that's the same rabbi that we mentioned earlier, and he really had a very harsh stance and position against the Romans. He said that they're never, ever transformationable. You cannot change them ever. So you would think that this guy said, well, it's a moot point. You can't talk to them. He created political solutions or diplomatic solutions for the Jewish people of his times in the 1st century with the Romans. Let's read what he did. Text number 6, page 122. The Roman government once issued a decree that all Jews may not observe the Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity. I mean, that's basically the foundation of Judaism. You don't have that, you don't have Judaism. That's exactly why the Romans enacted that. The Jews said to themselves, who should go to Rome to solicit annulment of the decree? Guess who they sent? Let Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai go, for he is experienced in miracles. Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did not have this magical wand. He was a great sage, wise man. But when we talk about the miracles, we're talking about creating diplomatic solutions. He came there, had discussions with them. He knew that the law, the established fact is that they are anti-Semites. We're not going to change them, but what we are going to do is negotiate with them. And he was quite successful in his negotiations with the Romans. So this is another beautiful story. But if you go throughout the history of the Jewish people, and of course the Jewish people were expelled from Israel, and we made our way to Middle Eastern countries, and that became the Sephardic community. And then we made our way to Eastern European communities. Today we're here in the United States. But let's talk about Jewish people in Middle Eastern countries as well as Eastern European countries. What the Jewish people always had to do is sort of have a point man, a person that was appointed, and that's pretty much what they did. And they're the ones who became advocates for the Jewish people. In some places, they would call them a derogatory term, and they would call them the court Jews. Have you ever heard that term, the court Jew? Doesn't ring a bell? But if you read books in the history, it was derogatory because the court Jew meant that it was a meek and feeble, weak Jew, always bowing down to the anti-Semite to gain some kind of concessions from them, and almost always failed. That was the way, the portrayal of these people. And in some cases, that might have been true. There was a court Jew, and they were ineffective. But that's more of a myth rather than a fact. The fact is that if we look through the course of history, till our very times, I'm talking about not in America, in Europe, they would have what's called shtadlanim. The word shtadlanim, that's in plural, shtadal, is an advocate. So that they were called in Hebrew shtadlanim. Tishtadel. In Hebrew, if you ask someone, can you help me with this? The person says, tishtadel, I'm going to, it's sort of like I'm going to try to do it. But it also has the word advocacy in it. They would become the advocates of the Jewish community. So these were people who were pretty much very well networked, and they were able to infiltrate the courts of big anti-Semites. And I'm going to talk about that for a moment. If you look on page number 123, you'll see figure 4.1. You're going to see historically stories of these great, I don't know if I should use the word great, but important Jewish advocates in Central Europe from 1500 to 1800. It goes through those examples. We won't go through them now because you can do that on your own, of course. But I want to talk about one case of an advocate for the Jewish people. This is in the 15th century. And there was a man by the name of Yosef of Rosheim. Yosef of Rosheim was an advocate on behalf of the Jewish people from Germany. The German Jews suffered, like any other community, suffered from decrees and policies that were made by the church. Okay, the church were the ones that really ran many of the decrees and policies that were enacted by governments. Church and government was, one and the same. That's why in America we have separation of church and state, because you never want to have that mix. It's unhealthy. Anyhow, so this Reb Yosef of Rosheim, he went to the courts of the Roman emperor. Okay, at that time Maximilian I, and he also met with Charles V. Right, Charles V. Who was Charles V at that time? He was a king, and Charles V was a grandson of, guess who? Surprise, surprise, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And they were the ones who founded and initiated and started and began the Spanish Inquisition. What was the Spanish Inquisition? It was mostly against Jews. It was certainly against everybody. But the whole point of it was to get Jews to convert to Catholicism. And what would happen if a Jew did not convert to Catholicism? You were expelled. And if you remained and you were a Marrano and they caught you, they literally burnt you at the stake, literally burnt you alive. It was an awful time for the Jewish people. This guy, Charles V, who's the emperor, he is in charge of the Inquisition. And yet Yosef of Rosheim goes to these people to advocate for the Jewish people of Germany. Whatever the decrees were going on, it's not clear what happened. But how do we know this? Because he wrote a memoir. And we're going to read just a little excerpt from his memoir, where we see that the guy put himself in real danger. He put himself in a position that would seem unworkable, that there would be no solution, and yet he was able to extract concessions and real solutions. And again, I wanted to mention, he did not come as a weak Jew, as a meek Jew. He came as a Jew with strength. He came with what we call Gaon Yaakov, with the greatness of Jacob, and he acted exactly like Jacob. I'm going to read text number 7, page 124. In 1531, the denouncers, I'm not sure who the denouncers are, but there must have been bad people, once again hounded the Emperor Charles V while he was in Belgium and Holland, lands uninhabited by Jews. The reason it's important for him to write that it was uninhabited by Jews is, God forbid he had a problem, he had no community to fall back on. There was no safety net for him. Many requested that, and to show you how bad the situation was, many requested that I travel to those lands to oppose the accusers. With the help of God, I was at the court of the exalted emperor for 4 months, from the 1st of Adar until the 1st of Sivan, pursuing the interests of the Jewish communities. Although Rothright, don't know who he is, attempted to swallow me alive and to bring about my demise, God in his great mercy sent his messenger and saved me from his hands and from those who sought to harm me. At that time, I had an audience with the emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed, and he responded sympathetically. During this period, when I had free time and I was secluded in my room, I authored a book entitled Sanctified Path. This is a very, very interesting story because he's really very proud of his accomplishment, because at the end of the day, he was able to gain some sympathy from the grandson of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And he is managing the Spanish Inquisition at that time. Spanish Inquisition ran for hundreds of years. People don't realize that it ran until the 19th century. I believe maybe even, the 19th century. Anyhow, so obviously his account is not comprehensive. There's a lot of questions about it, but certainly he used his ability to negotiate and bring about a concession that would bring security to the Jewish people in Germany. Very important story for us to know. Now, I'm not here to say and proclaim that if we take this position and if we take this path, that it's always going to land us security. Because if you look at the story of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, when they initiated the Spanish Inquisition, at that time, there was a great rabbi. He was called the Abarbanel. Anybody heard of the Abarbanel?
No.
That's like not knowing who Thomas Jefferson is, for real. And I'm not trying to belittle anybody, but he's like second or third after Rashi. He's a very great commentator on the Torah. So I'm just trying to show you how important it is to know who the Abarbanel is. And the Abarbanel is one of the great commentators of the Torah, very, very important commentator, great commentation. Is there a word commentation? Commentary on the Torah. How do I say commentation? Anyhow, I went to yeshiva. What do you want from me? Anyhow, the Abarbanel lived right when the Inquisition started. So what do you think he did? He is now he's the leader of the Jewish people, not only in Torah and in spirituality, but also in political affairs. So they send him off. He becomes the advocate for the Jews, but he was very, very unsuccessful. And the reason we have this picture on page 126, it depicts him. He's standing to our backs, and you could see his enemy, Torquemada, who comes out and makes all these, spews terrible accusations against the Jewish people and against the Abarbanel, and ultimately it failed. His mission failed. So we're not saying that it always works. What we're saying is that that is an option, and an option that's very serious and very important of how we have to deal with anti-Semitism. So again, once again, these stories are not about Jewish people coming to anti-Semites out of weakness. They're not coming as meek Jews. They're coming there out of strength with the power of Yaakov. For just a moment, how do you explain these people? Look at all these stories: Esav and Charles V, and the Roman emperor, and the story of Rabbi Yanai and the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and even today. On the one hand, we see that they're anti-Semites. They take positions against us, and yet at the other hand, they find some kind of sympathy towards Jewish people. I mean, it's a contradiction within one person to have those two parts of them. So today, when we can study the neurosciences of people, we're really not one-dimensional. We're unidimensional. We're very nuanced. People are very, very complicated. We feel one thing one way, we feel another thing another way. In 1 minute, we can feel one way and feel the opposite, 30 seconds later. It's the way we are. It's much more complex. And that's why there's this reading in text number 8a and 8b, which I'm not going to read, which is about Mel Gibson. And it's not to condone, it's not to say we understand Mel Gibson, because if you remember, I think it was like 20 years ago, he was caught, he was pulled over by a cop for a DUI. I think it was Malibu. It was 15 years ago. Anyhow, it turns out that he looked at the guy's tag and he asked him, "Are you Jewish?" He had a Jewish name. The guy says, "Yeah." And he said, "This is really, I don't want to repeat, but he said awful things about the Jewish people." And I believe it was recorded, or the police. And then he made a movie. But anyhow, the point is that he was defended by one of his best friends who happened to be a Jew. I'm not here to defend him or anything like that. What we're trying to point out is that, yes, he could be a guy who has sympathies towards Jews, can even say he loves Jews and truly have some kind of a connection to Jewish people, but at the same time, they can espouse all of those things. The reason that's important is because it helps us to understand what's going on the ground, the realities of anti-Semitism, that there is a way to sort of penetrate into the heart and the soul of another human being. There is that possibility here. So let's now focus more. We're going to go back to the stories of Pompidou, and we're going to add another story to show how it is possible in the intricacies and the complications of humanity. There is a way to create a sense of, not a sense, we can create safety and a solution or a partial solution for Jewish people. So first of all, we have to distinguish what was happening for thousands of years. In the past, our ancestors had limited options. I mean, what was Joseph in Germany supposed to do for the Jews there? Was he supposed to take out his F-16 and bombard the Vatican? I mean, what was he going to bring out his Merkava, the tanks, the machine guns? What was he going to do? So he was left pretty much with very limited solutions at that time. But today we live in a very different world, and most Jewish people, I would argue or pose, that live in democracies, except, I don't know, for Jews in Iran. Any Jews in North Korea? I don't think so. I hope not. Where else do Jews live that they might not live in complete safety? Besides Iran, where else? I mean, everybody is pretty much in.
Libya's pretty bad.
There's no Jews left in Libya. There are no Jews in Libya. Anyhow, but there's, for the most part, not most, but everybody, we could say there's 10,000 Jews in Iran. That's insignificant. I'm not saying every Jew is significant, but it's insignificant of the total number. If there's 15 million Jews, we're all living in democracies, which means that we live in a much different world. If we live in democracies, what do we get to do? We can wage war against the enemies of Israel, anti-Semites, against the haters. So we can, I'm talking about wars of words. We can't just take out guns. Israel can fight with guns. But the average person, the average Jew, not necessarily has to go out there and send what people call the court Jew or the advocate. We can get up there and have wars of words, and we can boycott, and we can shame, and we can call out, and we can cancel. We can get on social media and say all the things we want and really, really fight back. We can do that. Protests, which we've done for many years. So that's exactly what the Jewish people did when Pompidou came to the United States in 1970, after he declared that he's going to be selling these MiGs to Libya. The news reported 50, but it's probably 150. The French president comes to the United States for a state visit. He was going to visit the president of the president of France was visiting the president of the United States. So it's a state visit, President Nixon at that time. And guess what all the Jewish people did at that time? They protested in front of his hotel. This guy couldn't sleep, probably had nightmares for the rest of his life. He was fuming. The next morning, he complained about it. He said that he was not only insulted, he was angered. His wife they were terribly angered as to what happened, what the Jewish people did. And the reason we're telling you this is because we have to ask a question. Did it accomplish anything, all of those unbelievable protests? So let's read, first of all, how angry he was on page 131, text number 9. President Nixon made a hurried trip to New York yesterday to apologize to President Pompidou, who was angered by what he termed insults to him and his wife during a pro-Israeli demonstrations touched off by his state visit to the United States. The French president had been angered by jostling that members of his party received from demonstrators in Chicago. So it wasn't only New York. It looks like they were really harassing these guys in Chicago, also in Chicago, whose actions were marked by boos and angry cries, and by what he viewed as acceptance of such hostile acts by the Chicago police. So even the police didn't really defend him. They sort of like looked the other way and let the Jewish people or the people who were close to, closing up the demonstrations. Anyhow, the question is, what were the results of these demonstrations? Pretty much nothing. Nothing changed. In fact, he became more emboldened, and he became more obnoxious, and he defended his position that he's going to sell these MiGs to Libya. He didn't say, obviously, he hates the Jewish people, but he said it has no impact, no effect. It's not going to harm the Jewish people. So nothing came as a result of these demonstrations. The Rebbe at that time spoke about this, and the Rebbe spoke about this twice. Once he spoke about it at the time, right after those demonstrations happened, and then the Rebbe explained more about it a year later, because there was a success in minimizing the damage that Pompidou did to Israel. Here's what the Rebbe writes. The Rebbe, by the way, this is a recording that you can actually hear, and it's transcribed. So we're just going to read an excerpt of the Rebbe, what the Rebbe spoke about at that time. Page 132, text number 10a. Here's what the Rebbe said. The public protests against President of France angered French officials. This blocked any lobbying efforts that French Jews might have been able to make to prevent or at least reduce French assistance to Arab countries that are hostile to Israel. So the Rebbe is making a clear argument. The Rebbe is saying that that French Jews, it was their job, because they're the ones who are networked with the French president. They could have created some kind of solution for Israel at that time. So what did these demonstrations do? It created a sense of hostility towards the president, and now he's not going to want to listen to anybody. The stated reason for these protests was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country and that American Jews are not cowardly. This is a worthwhile objective when Jewish lives are not at risk. However, when Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets to Libya, we have two options. We can organize public protests, or we can make every effort to either prevent or postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets sold, or at least prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. Such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that agreements of this nature have been reached in the past. Now, when the Rebbe says that the proof is in this agreement, we don't know what he's talking about here. So the Rebbe qualifies this a year later and explains what the proof was. Here's what the Rebbe says. This is the Rebbe speaking a year later. When Mr. Pompidou visited the United States, there were mass protests against him intended to intimidate France. This effort backfired. It can now be said that despite the French embargo against selling arms to belligerents in the Middle East, the French president had allowed the sale of small arms and light weapons to Israel, items that can be sold without attracting publicity. However, as a result of the demonstrations, the approval of such sales was withdrawn. So there was something going on behind the scenes, and those the demonstrations ruined it for Israel. After some time, when he was no longer being disparaged, he resumed dealing with Jews behind closed doors and reinstituted the small arms sales. He also arranged for 300 Jews to be able to leave Egypt. All of this was accomplished without demonstrations and without publicity. The Jewish media was warned against disclosing any of this. That's why nobody knew. People ran to the demonstrations because it wasn't reported. And we only knew of this from the non-Jewish press. It came out later on. The conclusion we must draw from this case is that we do not influence anti-Semites by constantly yelling at them, you're anti-Semites, you're a thief, you're a murderer. Rather, engage them in diplomatic conversation. Although such individuals are well aware of what we think about them, they're nevertheless human beings and wish to behave like human beings. They're complicated. People are complicated. These are not Hamans, these are not Hitlers. They just have biases against Jewish people, and they are workable. If we can have negotiations with them, diplomatic solutions can be created. So this is another example where we see clearly that the path of Jacob prevailed versus the path of war. And by the way, I'm not saying war is always off the table. War should always be the last resort, and that's what Israel does all the time. Israel has to do that. Israel does not have the appetite to go to war, every 6 months. It's not something we want to do. But let me tell you another beautiful story, because Pompidou, I don't think, was transformed by any of this. He just sort of, showed less bias towards Israel and sold Israel, weapons that he felt would be acceptable to not to violate the embargo, so to speak. But there's an interesting story about Senator Jesse Helms. You remember Jesse Helms, Jackie?
No.
You don't remember him because he's a guy from the 70s. I remember Jesse Helms.
I remember.
All right. Jesse Helms was a senator from North Carolina, and he was elected to he was elected in 1972. And for more than a decade, he always voted consistently against the interests of Israel. He was no friend of Israel. He voted against foreign aid for Israel, various different times. So whenever they wanted to send money to Israel, he was always voting against it. So he was not seen as one of the better buddies of Israel. He was not a good guy, at least in this regard. anyhow, even when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, you don't remember that one? I remember that, and he was screaming that the United States should cut ties with Israel. Imagine that America and Israel would have no relationship. That means no embassies and there's no political relationship with each other. So here's the interesting thing. 2 years later, after 1982, when he announced that America should cut off its ties with Israel, in 1984, he got invited to an event in Washington, D.C. What was this event in Washington, D.C. in 1984? It was in April. He was invited to an event where that President Reagan, both houses of Congress, the Senate and the Congress, designated the Rebbe, right? On his 82nd birthday. It was the Rebbe's 82nd birthday in 1984. And they honored the Rebbe with Education Day. The Rebbe didn't accept this honor for himself personally, but it was, the purpose of the designation was to promote the Rebbe's campaign to upgrade ethical and moral foundations of education in the American public schools. The Rebbe spoke a lot about how we can bring ethics and morals to the kids without violating church and state rules. So anyhow, Jesse Helms is invited to this party. Now, who was very upset about this? None other than the very famous Alan Dershowitz. Okay, Alan Dershowitz is probably maybe one of the most famous Jews in America today, and even at that time was quite famous. He wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, complaining, saying how upset he was that Chabad would invite a guy who is biased towards Israel. In fact, he claimed hated Israel, and he had all the rights to, he had a lot of proof of that. And the Rebbe, in his unique manner, always sees things in just a very different way, in a practical way, in a clear manner, in a way that can resolve things, that gets things done. It just doesn't remain in the clouds. It comes to the ground and it gets resolved. The job gets done. So the Rebbe replied that the event did not honor Jesse Helms. Alan Dershowitz is saying, why are we honoring Jesse Helms to come? The Rebbe said, that's not what we're doing. We are inviting this biased senator for him to come to honor and pay tribute to the Jewish people, because it was Jewish people who were being honored. He is coming to honor us. And here is what the Rebbe wrote in his letter. It's like the postscript of his letter. So the complete letter is not here. By the way, I heard the story from Alan Dershowitz, because Alan Dershowitz said the story. I mean, not me personally, but it was at the Chabad Rabbis Convention, and I heard him say the story. So here's what the Rebbe wrote. It's a very important letter, and a reading for this course even. Text number 11, page 136. Here's what he writes. I trust you will agree that in regard to persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way in behalf of any and all causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there is a likelihood that it may be the forerunner to similar pronouncements in the future. So what do you have to lose? That's the first thing the Rebbe is arguing. Bring him in. What's the worst? He doesn't change. That's the worst. My experience with such people, though I've never personally met this said person, which is Jesse Helms, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. So the Rebbe didn't see him as this devout anti-Semitism. It was political and his Christian upbringing. He just didn't know much about Jews. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or religious imperatives. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to change in their positions, depending on the time, place, and other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into a hot war, nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite. However tempting it is to do so, even if the person vehemently denies it, it can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any. Instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. There is surely no need to point out to you that responsible Jewish leaders consistently cultivated good public relations. Indeed, even cordial relations with President Carter and his predecessors, going back to President Roosevelt, regardless of their sometimes openly negative feelings towards Jews and Jewish causes. The Rebbe is proving this, that we've saw time and again where people who have said awful things about Jews, they've shown their biases against Jewish people, yet we were able to gain concessions from them. We brought security for the Jewish people and mostly for the land of Israel. The bottom line is that Alan Dershowitz, he says the following: sure enough, I'm quoting him, it's not a reading, I have a quote from him. Sure enough, very shortly after he was honored, Senator Helms assumed a very influential role in the United States Senate's Foreign Relations Committee and became one of the strongest supporters of Israel and other Jewish causes as well. So obviously the Rebbe had an enormous influence or persuasion or persuading Jesse Helms that even with his very conservative values, he could become a beacon for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. Guess what? Jesse Helms, after that event, never ever voted against the Jewish state. He became the greatest advocate that the Jewish people ever had. That's the weird thing about Jesse Helms. It's a crazy story about Jesse Helms.
That's
Yes,
a big shocker too.
exactly.
That 180 turn that he did.
Yeah. It's a really important lesson. We could really have optimism when we can deal with this.
A couple years ago.
Yes, remember we had 2 years ago, the guy, I don't remember, he was a skinhead, and the point is that screaming and shouting to people, you're an anti-Semite and you're a hater, and shaming them, it feels good for us, and you're really helping yourself. It's sort of your therapy, but it doesn't help anybody. War you can always resort to at the end of the day. Wait, the hard part in life is, by the way, and this can be applied to anything, the people that you don't get along with, it's easy to shame them and kill them with your hate, but to bring them in is the hardest thing. So the bottom line is, it's a very important lesson that we took a guy. This story represents transformation. Really Pompidou doesn't represent transformation. Right. So it's a beautiful, beautiful ending to talking about how we can deal with anti-Semites. The bottom line is that the conclusion of this course is that, number one, we learned the idea is to remain focused, to remain calm. Number two, we will trust in Hashem, in God, and upgrade our connections with Him. It really is true. It really helps, because that keeps us grounded in our response. By the way, when we say believing in God and having a relationship with God, that doesn't mean that's the only thing we do. It means in our action we believe in Hashem. It doesn't mean we fold our arms and say, well, I believe in Hashem, so my check is coming in the mail. That's not what we believe. We believe that we will create natural means through which God can provide our security. So the blessing is from Hashem. Very important. We will not internalize anti-Semitism by altering our Jewish heritage. This was one of the bigger points for me, at least. I hope it made sense to you, that people who internalize anti-Semitism are never effective to help and resolve anti-Semitism. They don't do anything good. All they're doing is posting and then saying horrible things to anti-Semites, and they don't accomplish, and they live miserable lives. They're angry all the time. Just don't be angry all the time. Just understand the reality of life. We have to always remember that we have to be very proud of who we are. Nothing wrong with wearing a yarmulke, wearing a tzitzit, we're lighting Shabbat candles, wearing a Star of David, Chai necklace. No, nothing wrong with that. We have to be very proud of it. We have lots to be proud of. Another point is we will share our awareness of God's mission for all of humanity. They're waiting. The world, we are a beacon of light. We are shining light for the rest of the nations. So we're a light to the nations. So we have to shine that light, show them that path, show them how to bring meaning in their life. Another point that we learned, that we will thank God for the divine gift of the Holy Land, and we seek to strengthen its security and prosperity. It is our job as Jews living in America. We can't say, well, it's the Jews there, let them take care of it. No, we're connected to that land. And what we learned today, the idea is to avoid labels and public shaming, and instead we're going to work with whomever we can to ensure beneficial results for the Jewish people. So this is a very powerful idea that we've studied today, and this can be applied not only to people of influence. Guess what? Every one of us has influence. Imagine you're able to share ideas of what it means to be a Jew and create less of a bias or no bias by a coworker, by a neighbor, by a stranger, by whoever, and that person goes home and says, you know what I learned, on this day. I personally try to do that. This past Sunday, interestingly, I was davening at 9 o'clock. I was waiting for some people to come. Nobody showed up.
AM or PM?
AM.
That's why.
After COVID, I'm trying to bring back the minyan for Sunday at least. We're going to get it back. We're going to get everybody back little by little. But anyhow, so a young girl, college-age student, comes with her dad, and I don't know what they wanted. I said, yeah, can I help you? And they said, well, we're here to observe the service. I'm thinking, well, you should have come the day before. We have a lot of people on Shabbat, but today's Sunday, it's kind of weak. And I was thinking, maybe I'm just going to send them home, because if they're going to observe, it's just one guy putting on tefillin. It's kind of weird. And I'm going to have to explain myself. I'm just going to feel too conscientious. But then I said, what the heck? They came all this way. I said, look, I'm going to tell you the truth. Nobody's coming. It's just me. Do you want to observe me? And they said, sure. That's what we're here for. And they sat
probably
down.
had a lot of questions.
So at the end, after I finished the davening, I davened for half an hour, took off my tefillin. They were shocked. They never heard of it. They never saw it. I want to tell you, they weren't in any way biased or anything, but I taught them some
Wanted to
ideas.
learn, yeah.
And the guy told me one of the ideas I always talk about is that the Torah never tells us to be spiritual. You ever hear me say that? I always talk about it.
Oh,
The Torah advocates for holiness. If you do a mitzvah, you become holy, right? When you ever hear people, I'm kadosh. When people say, "Oh, I'm a very spiritual person,"
That means nothing.
they're trying to say that I don't need religion, because religion creates
we
spirituality.
hear that all the
Right.
time.
So saying you're spiritual is saying nothing. It's not really
Yeah.
anything, because
Kind of
spiritual
like
is
a
neutral.
push-off, Yeah.
It's neutral. Why is spirituality neutral? Because evil people, Hitler was a spiritual person too. Terrorists,
Oh,
before they
right.
commit terrorism,
Yeah.
they pray and do whatever they think they need
That's
to do.
right.
It's a very
Yeah.
spiritual moment to give up your
Right,
life.
right.
So spirituality doesn't say much about you. That's like saying I'm holding a fork. Well, I can kill you with the fork, or I can eat with it. So you're telling me something neutral about yourself.
Okay.
So what spirituality is a benefit of what you have in your life. Okay, that's what spirituality is. If I say I'm holy, it means objectively something. It means I'm doing something good. It means I'm living a linear life, which means I'm going higher and progressing, versus a circular life, a pagan who keeps going back to doing the same old habits over and over and over.
And I
Okay,
think that's that's the whole motive of Chabad, is to be able to find as many Jews throughout the world, to let them know, no matter where you are in what sect of Judaism, that you can become more holy by observing more mitzvahs, and you can start with baby steps just by lighting the candles. And it doesn't matter if you're in Korea, North Korea, South Korea, Jamaica, Tennessee, they want you to know that we're here to teach you, because they're spreading their love of Judaism and Hashem and teaching other people the mitzvot, and that's how they're elevating themselves. I think
exactly.
people from Chabad, that's the whole.
Just sign her
Like,
up.
I don't have to sign her up. I paid her. She's on the payroll.
But
But
that is how they are, like, in the
Jackie just pretty much explained our mission
world. That is the
statement.
mission statement.
And it's kind of a long mission statement, but it is true what
Yeah.
that mission, you should write that up. For real, help me out here.
I will.
But basically is the
I'll try
idea
to
that
articulate it.
in Chabad, we're not looking to make people to do every single mitzvah, because at the end of the day, who could do every
Because
single
you guys
mitzvah?
were kind of born into that, where other people weren't.
Correct.
So it's kind of, you get to learn it as you go.
So we're helping people to, each person has a different pace. So if
Yeah.
somebody's going a little too slow, we got to nudge them and say, you got to go a little faster.
Right.
Yeah.
If somebody's going too fast, we have to say maybe slow down, whatever you have to
Whatever
just
they
calibrate
are,
to each
you meet
person.
them at where they are.
Exactly. But that's holiness.
Right.
Paganism is a circular. So you never move. You just keep staying in the same place, and there's barely any movement. So that's paganism. But what's the end of the last point I want to make, which really sort of shifts the focus from the anti-Semite, and now it focuses it between us as Jewish people. At the end of the day, we really don't have friends that we could really rely on. We temporarily have friends that we could rely on, so they come and they go. We can never say that's the buddy that's going to stay eternally forever with us. But it is important for us as Jewish people that we have to be united with one another. It is our blessing, it is our strength when we show unity amongst the Jewish people. But what is unity? Unity is not when we're all alike. Many people say, well, let's unify. What they really mean is actually to divide, meaning you be like me, and I don't want to have everything about you is wrong and everything about me is right. Well, that's not very unifying.
Yeah.
That's for the politicians to talk that language. What does unity mean? In my eyes, unity means is that we have to recognize that not all of us are the same. Each one of us is unique. But as groups, we might be unique and we might be different. Some do this amount of mitzvot. Some struggle with mitzvot in one way. Some struggle with another way. Some are focused in progressing life and making life better in this way. We have to embrace each other for what we contribute into this world. So if you wear this kind of yarmulke and you don't like the color of it, that doesn't mean I'm going to disparage that person and say you're wearing the wrong color yarmulke. Just because a person doesn't observe in the way you think they should observe doesn't mean that they're less than you. And just because a person is too observant to say, wow, these people they look funny, they look weird, they have long payas or whatever, that's not fair either. You know, there's a verse that says, Barchenu Avinu Kulanu Ke'echad, that God blesses us when we are all united, when we're all one. That's the blessing. And if you look at our enemies gain, their morale is boosted when they see our weakness in that we are divided. So even in modern days, they love when the Jews are divided. Haman loved when the Jews were divided. It's interesting because Haman made it in order to convince Achashverosh, the king, to get rid of the Jews. What did he complain? He said, look at these Jews, they're all over the country, all over the empire, I'm sorry, in various different countries. And therefore, they're one day going to, from all these different places, they're going to network and they're going to take over and conquer us. And therefore we must stop it in its tracks. It's a cancer, and let's wipe them out.
Right.
But really he was saying, well, that's one point that makes sense. But then there's a deeper meaning to what he's saying, that the Jewish people are scattered all over. And you know what he was saying? He's saying to Achashverosh, don't fear the Jewish people with their power, because they have no power. They are scattered, not physically, geographically. They are scattered in their unity, in their togetherness. They're not together. They are scattered from one another. They don't see, they don't see eye to eye with one another. So, that's what we sing all the time.
What does that mean?
It's the unity of Hine Matov. How great is it? How good is it when we're together and we're sitting with brothers and sisters? Those are the songs that we sing as Jewish people.
At the end of the war, FDR wanted to put a few Jews in every state, right? He didn't
Yes.
want everybody.
Yeah, he was afraid that the Jewish people in one place will have too much power. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
I don't know how serious it was. It
You have
was.
to go to Idaho, you have to go to South Dakota.
Yeah. Anyhow, so the bottom line is that this is at the end of the day, what brings the greatest power to the Jewish people is what we call Avat Yisrael, when we love one another. And love does not mean you have to be like me. Love means I accept you for who you are. And if you are 100% wrong, I'm going to still love you and figure out how to convince you. I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to embarrass you, and I'm not going to wage a war of words with you. I'm going to kill you with kindness. That's what I'm going to do. That's what true love means. All right, so this is the end of the course, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. And I want to wish everybody a happy Hanukkah. Sunday night at 4 o'clock, we're going to have our parade. Harvey's leading the parade. I have a menorah for him. I got the menorah and the bass and all the wonderful things.
There's one parallel. If I was writing the book, I'd write it, but they didn't ask me. In the 60s, the civil rights movement, right? There were two approaches. There was Martin Luther King,
Yes.
who was peaceful protest, and then there was the Black Panthers.
And which one was more successful? Tell me.
MLK. He's got so many
MLK.
streets and hospitals
We have a holiday for him. That's a very good point, by the way.
Streets and hospitals.
So there were two approaches back then.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. I did not think